Well, welcome. Let me see. I've got a little bit of a different setup today, so we'll see how many things can possibly go wrong. That's generally what happens. Okay, let's see here. I'll get my video on. Oops. Okay, so give me a thumbs up if you can still hear me. Making sure that still works. Give me a thumbs up. And did the in the chat, did the music sound okay? Were you guys able to hear that? I'm not sure what else might have gotten messed up. It did work. Okay. Okay. Cool.
Yeah, it did work.
It did. Okay. Awesome. Awesome. Okay, so coming up next week, we have Matthew Phillips is going to be coming and talking with us about psychological safety and remote work. And he's done a bunch of polling and things on this. And I've always enjoyed everything I've heard Matthew talk about. And as a matter of fact, I was out at, he's teaching a college class in St. Louis. And I was out there here a while back and he asked me to guest lecture. And this talk was actually kind of came out of some of the things that he was saying was really valuable for his students, which was lots of stories about just working in the software industry. So that brings us to today's talk, which is Code Perilous, Adventurous Tales of Software Creation. And I may be overselling this just a bit, but hopefully it will still be exciting to everyone. But to get started, just to make sure everything works here, take this picture, and I am going to make sure this shows up. We should have a Slido for everyone. Let me make sure that's going to show up for you. And so my question is going to be about this particular picture. So let me make sure this opens up for everybody. Okay, so you should have, it should come up, and we've just got 6 questions. We're going to kind of combine the quiz and questions as we go. I think we did that last time here too. So let me click play here to make sure this shows up for everybody. And so keep this picture in mind because the next question is just about that particular picture. What are those pictures from? So your options here are Milton's Paradise Lost, McDonald's Fantasties, Chesterton's The Man Who Was Thursday, or Spencer's The Fairy Queen. So you have 6 seconds left to answer. And this is mostly just to make sure everybody's on and able to answer questions. So what do you think? And it looks like, what do we get here? Looks like most people said Spencer's the Fairy Queen, and that is correct. Those are pictures from a book of Spencer's the Fairy Queen. So if you, whoops, okay, I wasn't expecting that. We'll take care of that. Okay. So good. Looks like most of us were able to get in. If you can't, go ahead and click and, oh, actually, let me do one other thing here. See if I can add the link for you. Clear step. Nope. I may not be able to add the link, but if you go to slido.com and type in that number, so we'll be asking those as we go. And today's a short session, so and we'll give away a copy of a T-shirt. Or not a copy of a T-shirt, but an actual T-shirt. Okay, moving on. So here's what we're going to be covering quickly today. 5 tales of coding adventure. We're going to be talking about an online market research app first, then the finance auction system, a video management system, an ERP system, and then a debt collection system. So these are all projects that I either worked on the teams or was somehow involved in, and projects that I learned things from. Slido code, let me see. Actually, I may be able to just give you the link now. I see where we're at. So let's do, here, David. There's the link. I think that will probably get you into it. If not, it will show you the code when we come up here. So these are the 5 things we're wanting to walk through. So let's take a look at these. So first, we're going to talk about an online market research app. And this was a project that my company worked on, and it was through working through it, one of my big takeaways was trying to get to the point where you could deliver something, but you delivered everything. And what this software was doing is this was a company that would do market research. So like they'd bring in, what they'd done in the past is they'd bring in people and show them, the new Coke bottle and say, how does this make you feel? And somebody would say, it makes me feel angry. And someone else says, it makes me feel thirsty. And, they say, okay, we want the bottles that make people feel thirsty. Anyway, they do those types of things to make sure that the packaging and the advertisements and stuff were getting the response they wanted from their target audience. So What this company was wanting to do is replace the in-person meetings that were pretty expensive to pay people to come and all be in one location with an online version of it. The goal was to save clients money and also expand the number of people and how fast they could actually turn these things around. So the system needed to handle multiple languages. It was based in Quebec, needed to handle multiple languages. And in Quebec, there's like lots of rules. If you put up a sign that's in English, there has to be another sign in French that's tall, that has letters that are bigger, and lots of rules around that. It also had to handle, and many of their clients were in different countries. I think they had German and French and English. They had many different types of questions and needed different types of interactive feedback widgets. So the points of success, the things we did that really made this work well for them is they wanted it multilingual, but we were building it from the ground up. So we asked them, we said, okay, if you had this today, what language would be most valuable to you? And they said, well, we've got a client that we could use this for today if we had the English version of it. The first client that we think we could use this for was in English. So he's okay, well, why don't we build the English version? And then we'll come back once we get that working and you can test it with people. We'll come back around and you'll be able to, and then we'll make it multilingual. But if for some reason our assumptions about this are wrong and it's not going to work for anyone, there's no sense making it multilingual if we haven't even proven that it'll work for a single client in one language. So we did that. And on one hand, there was rework, right? We did it in English, and then we had to come back and extract out the strings and make it to where it would work with the other languages. On the other hand, it was a lot more efficient to make sure that we actually had the system working before we started messing with the internationalization and multilingual capabilities. Um, Point B was simple things first. So we started with the most basic widget that we could that would give them the most generic way of asking questions, and then built more specific things because that way they could start using it right away. We also did very rapid feedback. This was something where most of the time we were showing them something, getting feedback from them, and then turning it around overnight or a few days later. We also built a lot of things with flexibility. So instead of building lots of tables that you could sort stuff in the application, there were a lot of places where we just said, okay, Excel works really good for sorting this information. We'll just give you the ability to download everything, maybe filter it just a little bit, but download it as a CSV file, and then you can work with it in Excel. So it kept it really, really flexible without investing a lot of time in building different ways to manipulate reports in the application. We also focused on automation on the deployment, which is how we were able to turn things around so quickly overnight. And there were constant conversations going between us, the developer side of things, and the people that were actually using this. In this case, we were meeting and talking, but there was also just an ongoing chat where if anybody had any questions, saw anything that looked weird, that conversation was consistently coming back and being discussed with the developers. We were doing face-to-face communication, having a lot of conversations that way, but there was this, it wasn't something where there was a wall between the developers and the people actually using the application. Okay, so Slido question about this particular projects. Here's the things, just kind of some things that from the project I took away that as keys of success. So question for you, what was the advantage of starting with the English version? What was the advantage of starting with the English version? Was it because it required less rework? Did it allow them to start generating revenue? It met Quebec's language requirement, or avoided difficult German markets? What do you see as being the advantage of starting with the English version? And yes, it allowed them to start generating revenue, particularly when you're working with startups. It's a lot easier to kind of sell this of let's get you working in one area and you can start making money, and then we'll continue to develop it in other areas. I've seen this as being a lot more difficult to sell to large organizations that are like, no, we want to build the entire thing and then just start using it. But even though it's harder to sell to large organizations, as some of the things we'll look at here in just a minute, it sometimes can be just as important because that ability to prove things out, even if a large organization is saying that they don't want to do that, sometimes is what determines whether the project is successful or not. As far as it requiring less rework, it actually, it seemed like we had to do more rework, right? Because we put strings in English and then had to extract them out into a file. I think in the long term, it probably was, we proved a lot of things out. So it may have required a little bit more typing, but I think it was a lot more efficient typing. So is why that one probably wasn't the best answer there. We were able to eventually meet the Quebec's language requirement by making it multilingual, but we were kind of getting it out there for the particular client to start with. Okay, we've got Jason top spot, followed by Eric, Daniel, Jake, and NY. Okay, next system, financial auction system. This was a system that I wasn't working on directly. They brought me in just kind of asked, kind of at the quote phase of saying, what would you do to try and make this better? We're kind of in a bad situation here. Fortunately, well, on one hand, fortunately, because the project did not go well, I'm kind of glad I wasn't working on it. But I don't think any of the things I was recommending they do got done anyway, and maybe would have made it more likely to succeed. But in this particular situation, this was a system selling government financial instruments and auctioning them off to create a market for that, or to facilitate the market for that. It was going to replace an existing system, and they brought in a large consulting firm who hired lots and lots of contract developers. It was a project that was pretty high risk if something went wrong. The project was a catastrophic failure to deliver any working system. It was eventually canceled, and last I heard, it was moving to the litigation phase, which is where you start suing each other and stuff. So the points of failure on this particular project is there was a huge team, like a very, very large number of hired contractors, to the point that there was a lot of communication overhead that was really slowing things down. And we'll talk about this a little bit later on, but there's a point where adding more people does not make it faster. And in my experience, that number is a lot lower than most people actually realize. It was also a project that was agile in name. They had agile roles without actually attempting to achieve any agility. So they had people that were called themselves Scrum Master. Well, that doesn't necessarily make them agile unless you're actually trying to follow the agile principles. There were lots of talking barriers. When I was asked to look at a few things, I said, well, have you talked to this person and stuff? And most of the responses I was getting was, no, we can't talk to this person, or we can only talk to this person by going through this person. So it was very difficult to have free-flowing communication. Another big piece of this was the definition of whether something was done, or the definition of success on a particular story. When developers said the story was done, the way that things were being kept track of is they would mark that as this is completely done and we've made all this progress before anyone actually even tried to use it. So point E here is quality. There was the idea that testing might slow the developers down, so they didn't want to inject that into the development process at all. And as a result, they ended up with what I point out in point F is they were actually going backwards, because as things were said to be done, they weren't actually proven out. There was no testing. They'd be handed off to another team that several weeks later would go and try to see if it did what the user actually wanted it to do. Invariably, they'd find a bunch of bugs with it and file those bugs, which would go on the backlog, and the organization would, or the consulting firm would say, okay, well, we'll prioritize those later. And sometimes it was a matter of saying, well, that's a change request. You didn't ask for this up front, or you didn't specify this. But by the time it ended up back on the backlog, sometimes weeks had elapsed. So even the developer could have been like, oh, I can just change that really quick. I see wow, they're wanting this instead of this other thing I was assuming. It just went in the developer. By the time they got back to it, had forgotten all the context of what they're working on. And this kind of ties into point C, where there wasn't good communication and talking barriers, but they were actually creating bugs faster than they were creating stories. And so I remember when I was looking at this with them, they're like, okay, here's how much progress we're making. And I said, well, what I pointed out is they weren't actually factoring in the bugs. And when they factored in the bugs that were being opened, the amount of things to do was actually going up instead of down. So that was a very, it was a very big failure, but a lot of it came from these 6 points that I mentioned here, of having just a massive, massive team, which kind of made point C of all these talking barriers, and also got to the point that it was very hard to achieve any type of actual agility. Okay, question about this project. Get ready. And there's the Slido number if you haven't typed it in. So give you a few seconds and let's go. What can happen if correctness is not part of the definition of done? Will the software be finished faster? Maybe users won't complain. Teams can create more work faster than they complete anything. Or efficient billable hours. What can happen if correctness isn't part of the definition of done? And yes, teams can create more work faster than they complete anything. That needs to be they instead of the. But yes, that was my big takeaway. This is it's actually possible for teams to go backwards, and I think a lot of times we don't really realize that, or don't give ourselves, I'm not sure if it's we don't realize it or it's just kind of assume that working on things is going to make progress. But the actual fact is you can go backwards if you're not working on the right things or not working on it in a way that's actually proving and getting things to work. Okay, let's see. Oops, did I miss a slide there? Okay, Jason's still in the top spot. Moving on. Excuse me. Okay, video management system. This was actually the first, my first full-time development job as an employee. It was a system that would manage video, a video management system for dealing with educational content in schools. And so the idea is you could be in your classroom, teacher could be in the classroom, and they could say, okay, I want to play this video, Schoolhouse Rock at 8:35. That would be probably early, 9:35 a.m. And it's going to be part of this thing, and I can go and click on it, schedule it, it'll come play in my classroom at that point in time. So all these, the ability to have a big media library. Now, this probably doesn't seem like a very big deal, but at the time this was being built, this wasn't something that there were weren't a whole lot of options for, and this was really going into the educational space. They also did some interesting things with one project I worked with. They had customized it to be able to record interactions in a speech pathology, like where you'd go in for people that had kids that were having trouble speaking. It was at University, I think University of Chicago or somewhere down that direction, and it would record the interactions between the doctors that were working with people, and then they'd use them in the classroom setting to teach the up and coming doctors, the up and coming speech pathologists. So this was the first project I worked on, and I asked all the right questions right before I joined the job. I was told that the system had tests, so that sounded great. They had many customers. It was deployed at multiple sites. It was built by a pretty small team, so that was seeming like a positive. And it sounded like there was some type of automated build system in place. So I was like, okay, this sounds like a really good project to go into. Well, after I got there and started poking around, I discovered there were some things that didn't necessarily that maybe I forgot to ask about. One of them was that they had just lost all their subversion history. The system wasn't backed up and it went down, and so they had to just restore from a developer's laptop. But they didn't have any of the code that had previously been deployed at any of the sites, particularly the ones that had the high amount of customization on it. They just had the current snapshot, and I got there like a week or two after that had happened. So as I started discovering, here's the other things I discovered is there were tests, kind of, but the tests weren't actually doing anything. There were a large number of tests, and all they did was populate the database with things like the list of the states and stuff like that. So fixture data and things like that. They were just using the test framework to run it, but it wasn't actually checking anything in the application. The issue with customers, custom code had been lost, so they had customers running code that we could not see anymore. The team wasn't quite as stable as I had been led to believe. The lead developer had just left, like right after I got there. And then at some point, the manager freaked out, threatened to do physical harm to the owner, and also left. There was a lawsuit and stuff involved in that. And the build system, there was no actual build system. So coming into that environment, these are the things we did, which was mostly me, and then they had hired some other developers. But we started writing tests. Which was good because we didn't have any tests to start with. But we learned some things from that. I'll talk about in just a minute. Also set up a build system. So whenever somebody checked something in, it would run the build, run any tests that we had, make sure everything compiled, and turn these lava lamps on and off. We had a green lava lamp and a red lava lamp. I also started going on site with the customers. And as they hired more developers, I was one of the developers that had enough self-awareness and social skills to actually talk to other to customers, so that I did a lot of that. The other thing that I was particularly proud of, it was figuring out how to decompile a lot of the customers' code, find the bug in it in the decompiled code, fix it, recompile it, and inject it back into their system, even without having source code. We also started focusing a lot on code quality, so running sonar scans and trying to fix and bring those numbers down. The lessons I learned from this, and like I said, this was my first full-time development job years and years and years ago. Writing tests after the fact is not nearly as valuable as a test first. And so while it was a good thing we were doing that, it was not, the benefits take a lot longer to accrue than if you start from the beginning and start writing tests that way. It's a very test after the fact is a very, very different experience than test first. Setting up the build system with lava lamps, the owner really liked that because he could go and kind of, if the red lamp was on too long, he knew, okay, something's not going the way that the developers would like it to go. And it was a way for him to really kind of have insight into what was going on without necessarily getting flooded with technical details on things. Because he told me, he was like, Mark, I'll go ask a developer, how are things going? And they'll give me lots and lots of information and talk to me, and I leave even more confused than I am going into it. So I gave him kind of a simple, green red idea of how are things headed right now. Talking to the customer gave us the ability to really focus on priority. We also learned that having no backups is very expensive. And then on the sonar side of things, one thing that I learned from that is while the focus on code quality was good, particularly for new code that we're adding, I spend a long time going back and fixing things that had already been there. And in some sense, I actually now looking at this, I don't like the way I word this, where I said over investing in quality. There's types of, not all quality you can invest in gives you the same return on investment. And going through and changing things that Sonar is telling you about something that was written 3 years ago of saying, hey, you ought to put your variables in this way instead of this way, didn't have a huge payback for us. So while I was driving a lot of those numbers down, I'm not sure not all of those had the greatest return on investment. Writing more tests might have had more investment than going through and changing these kind of little bit arcane, the things that would be useful to know while you're writing the code, but maybe aren't useful in changing in somebody else's code from several years ago. So that was one thing that I took away from this, is there's a balance in, particularly with like sonar warnings that are really low severity. There's a balance, and you can spend a lot of time on those without getting good return on investment. Okay, so question about this project. What was Mark's lesson learned regarding code quality? Get ready. And was it that fixing sonar warnings should be the highest priority? Should be don't worry about tests until the code quality is good? Find bugs is better than sonar? Or fixing sonar bugs after the fact has diminishing returns? What was Mark's takeaway regarding code quality? And yes, so my takeaway was that fixing sonar bugs after the fact had diminishing returns. Fixing sonar warnings probably shouldn't always be your highest priority, particularly the lower severity ones. There's some that probably are important, but there's a lot of things you can do in code scans that may not necessarily give you a good return on investment relative to other things you could be investing in, because everything's always a trade-off. Okay, project number 4. This was an ERP system. And this was a project I didn't work on directly, but it was an order management system for the largest employer in a fairly small town, but the largest employer there. And there was a very big, grand vision for how they wanted to see this system fix all the problems, right? Big system fix all the problems. And their goal is to automate everything. It was going to replace lots of manual effort, paper processes, and spreadsheet systems. So what happened with this, and I was working onto a system kind of adjacent to this when they brought me in to say, hey, we're not getting a lot of value from our development here. But the big takeaway that happened with this project is the CEO now really hates software projects because in this case, they worked on it for 5 years without having anything to really show, without having anything that could start generating return on investment. And over those 5 years, they went through several generations of developers, people coming in, learning, kind of being up to speed and then moving on to something else. Some of that may have been due to the fact that without delivering anything, other places started looking like greener pastures. There were a lot of very brittle dependencies. The system I was working on that was kind of adjacent to this, I was interfacing with the system that they had been using. And when they rolled this out, this thing that we had been developing and they had been getting, at least telling us that it had saved several person years of effort of what they're doing manual, it just shut it down. So there were dependencies that had they been evolving the system probably would have evolved. In this case, it was a big cutover and shut down a lot of other things in the external system. My big takeaway from this, though, is if you want to keep a CEO happy and you need to let them see the investment, the return on investment they're getting. And just showing them demos, usually for 5 years, isn't going to make them feel confident that they're getting value out of whatever they're investing in. 5 years with nothing to show, you build a lot of trust through frequent delivery and saying, we deliver this and people are using it. It's making people happy. Going 5 years without giving something to the users that they can say, hey, this is making my life better, is a very dangerous thing. The overall system matters, and the return on investment you're getting something that you can show where you're getting increasing return on investment is very important. And having different silos of people working just completely separate from each other can be very, very expensive if you're trying to manage change, because they can work in ways that just shut everyone's productivity down. Okay, so what might be an outcome of going 5 years without delivering anything usable to users? What might be an outcome based on this project? The CEO might start to hate software projects, dragons may ravage the land, developers that should quit may stick around, or the delivered software will meet everyone's needs. So what's an outcome of going 5 years without delivering anything usable to the users? Yes, the CEO may start to hate software projects. It's possible you might have developers that should quit, stick around, but the big point here is you may get to a point that the people that are actually making the decisions to fund projects decide not to fund more projects because they haven't seen that they get good return on investment from software projects versus other things they could work on. Okay, we got Jason still in the lead, followed by Eric, Daniel, Steve-O, and Dave. Okay, last project, debt collection system. And my big takeaway from this one was the efficiency of small teams. And this system was offset debt collection system for the government. It would offset debts with potential payments between different government agencies. So if you owe one government agency money in one area and you're getting a refund from another area, it would make sure they don't send you a check and just hope you send them the payment. They'd actually say, oh, you owe us money, we'll take that money and send you whatever's left over. And Dave Marsh, who's on here, was actually working on this project before me. He was one of the early people on the project. They're replacing the existing COBOL system. It was quoted at 50 developers for 5 years was the original thing that they had said it was going to take. It was a distributed team. So that was the original quote. They ended up doing it with 5 developers and delivered something in 4 years. This particular project was one big thing that I noticed about is it was driven by creating agility, not by agile. So instead of focusing so much on being agile, the team was a lot more focused on how can we actually create the agility and flexibility. Now, we were looking at the principles and those things, but there wasn't as much concern about, oh no, we need a scrum master and we need to do this and we need to do that. The question was always coming up and saying, did this actually help us be more agile? So things we did, a test-first approach. So bringing test-driven development and behavior-driven development, and that being what was built from the very beginning, and that's what was driving the development. We also worked with virtual team rooms to where we had people distributed across the country, but they weren't just trying to communicate with chat. We had chat, it was very, very useful, but there were virtual team rooms. So all these different locations and people in different places were able to see someone, look them in the eye, have a conversation, see if they looked like they were busy, or see if they weren't there. I remember one point where I was going to a location in San Francisco, and I needed to get into the room. So I called in the team room and said, hey, I'm down in the lobby. Can somebody come get me? Because there was always somebody in that team room, which was really, really powerful, because if there ever was a question and somebody needed to talk to somebody on the team, it's just like, yeah, go to the virtual team room and somebody there can help you out. It also was a very small team. Like I mentioned, about 5 developers and a few coaches. That small team meant that it was very, very easy for communication to happen. And I'm fairly certain that had they gone with the 50, it would have taken a lot longer to deliver stuff that probably would have been a lot lower quality. There was also direct access to the users. Some of the people in the team room were people that were actively using the system every day. And the coaches had access to executives. That's one thing I've seen in a lot of teams is when you've got people coming in to try to help coach the software engineering process or coach the way the software engineering is trying to achieve agility. If there's too many barriers between the people making decisions, it can be counterproductive, and that's one thing this project did a very good job of. And some of it was because their team was small, so it was a lot easier to have those conversations. So the results were they could actually deliver this application all the way through to production without going against any change management processes in about 2 hours, because they had focused so much on the test-driven development and good deployment process. A high amount of collaboration. There was minimal dead weight. The developers on the team were all contributing. Well, almost all the developers on the team were very heavily contributing, and it tended to have a sifting project process to where if some weren't contributing a lot, they tended to self-select themselves out. Um, and the way that they were able to change plans increased agility, which is something like on some of the other projects I mentioned, where there was a upfront plan in a way that was actually reducing the amount of agility that was achieved. Some of the quotes from this is a paraphrase, just my best recollection of one of the higher level government executives. When we were going through this, they told me at one point, they said, even if this takes an entire extra year to deliver, this will be the least expensive of any system we've ever created. And part of the reason for that was with the small team, not only were we going faster, but there's a huge difference between hiring 50 people to work on something and 5 people to work on something. And by really doing a good job and being really ruthless in the way we were prioritizing, we were able to deliver the most valuable pieces that they were asking for as rapidly. And this executive was pointing out that they were, without having this huge spend, even if things took an extra year, they were very, very happy with the amount of investment that was being made on it. Some other projects I've been on have kind of had the opposite, to where they eventually just shut it down because the spend is so high and they're not seeing, because the project started with so many people. Whereas if they had started with a few and kind of grown into the optimal size, it would have been a lot easier for the executives to continue to fund it, because it wouldn't have been seen as a it wouldn't have been seen as a huge black hole that money was being sucked into. Another quote from this way of working is one of the developers told me, he said, I'll probably spend the rest of my career looking for another project like this one. And they were telling me that they weren't very confident they would be able to find one. But that way of working and that collaboration was very, very meaningful, and they really enjoyed it. Okay, so last question here. Having a small team did what in this case? Did it slow the project down, made the developers unhappy, made the project much less expensive, or made it hard to communicate? What did having a small team do in this situation? And yes, it made the project much less expensive. And in a lot of cases, there is overhead that is added by trying to scale the team beyond a certain point. And I think a lot of organizations are really bad at kind of identifying where that point is. Okay, so Jason, it looks like you took the top spot. So send me a screenshot of this, or just let me know you won, and your shirt size you're looking for, and the address to send it to, and I'll get that headed your way in the mail here pretty soon. I'm not sure which shirt I'll give you, because I've got some different size. Let me know which size, and I'll find one that's will work well for you. Just a reminder, next week we've got psychological safety and remote work, and then we'll take a little bit of break over Christmas and then come back strong probably mid to late January. So thank you everybody for coming. I appreciate it. Hopefully the short period worked well on going through this. I'll stick around for a while if anyone wants to chat. I'd love to talk to you. If you have any feedback on this talk, I'd love to hear that too. This is a new thing, and I'd like to hear what people say. But if hope to see you next week, and if I don't, you have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Hope to see you in the new year. If anyone wants to chat, feel free to just come off mute, and we can talk.
Mark, I'm curious about who that developer was. Who said that? Do I know them?
Yes, actually, I heard that from several developers.
Oh, okay.
Anita was one that mentioned that. We were having dinner with her and her family, and she had mentioned that. I heard it from a couple others. I think Andy told me that too. But there were several people that over time, when we got together with them years later, they mentioned that, and that was an encouraging thing to hear.
Yeah, that is good. It wasn't easy to get that going, that's for sure.
No, and having been on other projects since then, it made me appreciate everything you had to go through to make that happen.
Yeah, I think I absorbed probably the most amount of stress I ever have on any single project, just to make sure that we could reduce stress for the rest of it. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it was yeah, but it has been interesting. Several people I've talked to in years later have pointed back to that and said that's kind of saying that that's where my career has probably peaked as far as their enjoyment of their career. Um, so on one hand, that's good to hear. On the other hand, it's kind of a sad reflection on the industry, probably.
It is, and I'll tell you, I did some work at a big Canadian bank, um, first coach on a large sort of omni-channel program, and
Mhm.
they decided to work in an agile way, and they were, I didn't have to do much to get them going. I taught them everything. Like it was amazing. They were doing BDD in the first couple of months of the project,
So cool.
and so they used a really agile risk identification and assessment process, and they started prioritizing by risk as well as value. It was great. And I went back to that bank a couple of years ago to do some other work, and it turned out that, and those guys all said the same thing. They said this is the we could never imagine working any other way. And then
Hmm.
2 years later, not only had they regressed because of just new leadership and things, but the lessons from that program were not shared across the bank.
Yeah.
And so I think that's just kind of a typical thing that happens, right? It's too
Uh-huh.
bad.
I and I Similar experience with something where we're pointing at the offset program and saying,
Mm,
hey, here's how this worked, and even if that doesn't work for this particular project you're doing, we should at least start there, right? If we've got something that's been
mm,
successful and a bunch of things that haven't, let's start with doing some of the things that have been successful, particularly I remember conversations around team size and stuff, and
mm,
saying maybe we should let's start with that because we can always grow bigger and stuff. And I kept getting lots of pushback saying, yeah, that was just a unicorn. And I
mm.
we could never get an explanation of why they thought it was a unicorn. Just like, yeah, that won't work. That we're so confident that it won't work, we don't even want to try that. So yeah,
Wow.
it's very interesting.
It could be the personalities, like the Stevens of the world and Alyssa's, it could be that.
Yes, yes, I think there's something to be said for the executive level on that project was incredibly strong and
Mm,
not it's difficult to replicate that level of executive
yeah.
I guess drive.
Yeah. No, drive and they really did just buy into it. They had no idea. I don't think Alyssa knew what was coming, but she she didn't she liked it. So it was interesting. Um, I remember one thing that they did, right? They set aside, as part of the contract, they set aside quite a substantial amount of money for software tools. I don't know. Do you remember that? And so we didn't have to go through the procurement process every time we needed like another tool, whether it was for testing
Right.
or for whatever. And so it was just part of the contract, and all we needed to do was say, here's the tool that we've selected, and
Hmm.
here's how much it is, and then the contracting officer was able to just approve it, and we had it the next day, literally. That
Right.
was that was a huge accelerator. Remember all those, like all that teleconferencing facility and the smart boards and all that stuff, that all happened
Yes.
really quickly because of that, right? Yeah.
And I think there were a lot of things that would have been more difficult had it gone through it needed to be procured. It would have raised probably a lot of red flags for things that were kind of trivial, but would have gotten lots of
Mm.
people wanting to have opinions on.
Yeah, I think you're right. You're right. I mean, holy cow, we used AWS in 2011,
Mhm.
and we got to do that. That was, kind of hard to believe, eh?
Yes, yes, that
I,
was. I remember at one point somebody was coming in and trying to sell the internal cloud, and they were describing how you could ask for something to be stood up, and 2 weeks later they'd have it ready for you. And I remember people saying,
mm,
"Why would you want to do that?" But
yeah, I don't know. There might be other people who want to chat, but I mean, this is fun for me. I'm remembering
yeah,
this time in 2011, exactly this time when our first test. I don't know if you remember. It was when you came on board. Our first test of our performance test came in.
uh-huh.
It was six hours it took for the job to run, and it needed
Yes,
to run in 17 minutes. And there was panic. There was panic, but there was no real panic on the team because we just started
uh-huh.
running experiments in AWS, right? We just started running all
Right.
those experiments we did, and then finally,
Well, I think the fact that you were getting feedback like that early on instead of after,
mm,
right before you go live, I was talking to somebody on a different project that was getting ready to go live, and like, yeah, we're having all these performance problems now, but I mean, they were getting ready to go live in 2 weeks. This
Right.
was this was somebody that had worked with us on that project, and they were
Okay.
they were saying that now we need to, and it was interesting how much we were able to shift that forward. So there was less
Mm,
panic at the end because all those things had not that there wasn't anything that got discovered toward the end, but there were fewer things, and most of them were
right.
smaller and easier to fix.
Yeah. 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 And that's, yeah. I remember thinking these are all our risks that we have, and we've got to mitigate these. And we were just mitigating one after another. I remember even after that job came in, it